What I'm about to tell you is one of the creepiest and weirdest true stories that I know of. Content warning right up front, it involves real people actually dying on the toilet. Now, oddly enough, I've actually not seen anyone else on the internet cover this story, or at least making the connections that I'm about to make here. You'll see what I mean in a moment. It involves two separate deaths that are seemingly unrelated as far as everyone else in the world is concerned. But we wrote an article on Cracked about this. It was written by Ryan Menezes, and it was about these two odd death stories that are each on their own somewhat famous, but no one has ever connected them, and the connection between the two is so weird that it will almost make you believe in the supernatural or in curses, or at least that something else is going on beyond the way the story is being told in the news. Just to be clear, what I'm about to tell you is not an urban legend. I'm going to link to the original sources in the post and in the description on YouTube. These are actual mainstream news sources. Everyone agrees that these deaths happened as described, which is going to make all of what I'm about to say all the more unbelievable. The first guy that I'm going to talk about, you can Google the name. It's Michael A. Godwin. He was someone who was on death row for a murder and a rape committed in 1981. He was sent to the electric chair, then upon appeal got that the death sentence reduced to a life sentence, which he was serving in a prison in South Carolina. In 1989, he was found dead in his cell. He was found naked, sitting on his metal toilet in the jail cell, having been electrocuted to death by headphone wires. That they said that the wires were in his mouth, that he had the wires hooked to his television because he was trying to listen on his headphones as not to disturb his cellmate or whatever, and that the current through the wires had electrocuted him. This is the first of two deaths, but this one is very famous because it made ironic death news all around the world. Because you see, this guy was sentenced to the electric chair, avoided it on appeal, and then was electrocuted to death on a metal chair, his toilet in his cell. Almost like the electric chair pursued him and got him. And this story, if you Google that name, Michael A. Godwin, you will find hundreds of like news of the weird and ironic death stories, including on crack.com, which we ran because it was reported on UPI. It's, you know, you have official press releases from the prison. You have a coroner's report. Everyone agrees this guy died by electrocuting himself on the toilet in his cell. Now, before we get into the second death, there's a few things that some of you have already detected. You've used headphones before. You've used earbuds with wires. You have almost certainly had some where the coating has frayed off of, or you've touched the bare wire, and you were not electrocuted from it. That's because there's not any substantial current running through that. It's just an electrical signal. I guess it's not inconceivable that somehow there was a short or something inside the television that sent current through the wire, but even then, I think through a headphone wire, sending that much current through it would just melt the wire. If you go on the internet and try to find any example of anyone dying this way, where they've been electrocuted through earbuds or something like that, 100% of the time you will find out it's a hoax if you trace all the way back to the source. A lot of the news stories are like out of China, things like that, and it's always very questionable. And if you look for people debunking it, eventually you'll find someone saying it can't happen. There's not enough electricity running through that wire to kill a person. But as far as I can tell, literally no one ever followed up on this because, one, who cares? The guy was, convicted murderer. He probably had it coming, is what the way everybody kind of sees it. And it's a hilarious death, so certainly we don't want to make it less hilarious by finding out the truth. So whatever. That story on its own, not that creepy. Let us now go to the second death. This one is a guy named Lawrence Baker, also convicted of murder. Also sentenced to the electric chair. Also, upon appeal, got the sentence reduced to life in prison. He was serving it in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Completely different prison, completely different state. 8 years after the previous incident, which occurred in 1989, in 1997, Lawrence Baker was also found dead in his prison cell, also sitting naked on his metal toilet, also having been electrocuted by the wires from his headphones that they said had been plugged into his TV. Again, you can look up the sources on this. There's a news article from UPI. You've got quotes from the coroner. You've got everyone involved agrees this is how this person died, even though, as I just said, it seems wildly implausible. If you're the skeptical type, you're probably thinking, well, it's prison. People probably die in prison all the time. Safety standards are probably very poor. Those televisions they're using are probably, poorly made models or something like that. Here's the thing. In the hours I spent trying to research this, because I served as the editor when Ryan wrote his article at Cracked, we kind of developed this together. And all the time I spent trying to fact check this, because when he wrote it, it didn't sound true. It didn't even sound plausible. I can't find a third example of anyone on Earth having died this way. The only two people I can find who died on a metal toilet being electrocuted in any fashion both escaped the electric chair, and both had the electric chair come and metaphorically kill them later. If you say, well, maybe those televisions were defective, maybe they had some issue with wiring, I can find no indication that there was ever any kind of a recall. Or again, where even a third or fourth or any other people, because if such a television was manufactured, if that was the cause of death in the 1989 case, they apparently used those same televisions, I guess, in that other prison in another part of the country a decade later. They had the exact same flaw. But even then, even if the guy's headphones were just two heavy copper wires that he plugged directly into the outlet, I'm not sure that kills you. In the news stories and the statements from the officials, in the second case, they even said they're not sure that the metal toilet had anything to do with the death or anything to do with the circumstances, that they're actually not sure. The whole thing is just very fuzzy, and in both cases it seems like they just kind of didn't look into it very hard because who cares? But if that's not what happened, then that raises a question of what did happen. Because here's where your imagination kind of goes wild, because if the first guy, Godwin, like let's say he died of a heart attack or something like that, and they just, because he had the wires in his mouth, they incorrectly deduced that's what killed him, or maybe they just didn't look into it very hard, maybe the autopsy just didn't turn up anything conclusive and they just assumed, well, it must have been an electric shock. One, you would think there would be a lot of follow-up in terms of making sure those televisions and that setup is safe for other prisoners, because you don't want prisoners dying just left and right. They are under your custody. But if so, nobody seems to have done that. So if that's the case, if that one was just a misunderstanding, or maybe that was just their best guess as to what happened, then what was the second case? Because when Lawrence Baker died in that exact same fashion, is it a thing where maybe somebody in the prison who wanted him dead, they like saw this first famous case on like the Darwin Awards and all of these wacky lists of crazy deaths and thought, hey, let's if a person can actually die this way, let's stage it so that this guy we hate, that it happens to him too. But if so, if they like tried to trick him into like wiring up his headphones in a way that would shock him, they would quickly find out that doesn't work. So they would have to have killed him some other way and then put him on the toilet with the wires on his head, and then just assumed that officials would draw the same conclusion, the same very unlikely conclusion that the officials in the first case drew, in the Godwin case. One way or the other, I can't come up with a plausible, non-crazy scenario for what happened here. And yet, I can't find where anyone else has ever reported on this or even thought that it was interesting at all. There are some books on like lists of like 100 weird deaths that have both cases in there. And it's just written up like, isn't it wacky that this happened twice? It's like, no, not at all. It's impossible. You have two identical, too ironic to be real deaths. And I keep thinking that I'm missing something, that maybe there were in fact a rash of deaths connected to these televisions, doing something with the TVs that is very common, just trying to listen to them on your headphones. And in the second case, they were like, well, the guy was using homemade headphones. That was the problem. But What can you make them out of? If there's no current going into the headphone jack, what could you make them out of that would turn that into a lethal act? And if it's that easy, then many people, inmates and whoever else bought that model of television, would have had the same thing happen to them. So I keep thinking that there's got to be something that I don't know. In fact, I'm sure there is, about the nature of the deaths, the nature of how it could have happened, the nature of how many times it's happened. If so, my ability to Google it has fallen through, and unfortunately, as much as I would like to, I cannot abandon my life to go investigate this, because if I could, I would. By the time we wrote this article at Cracked, we no longer had what you would think of as like a newsroom of people we could do original reporting and work the phones and call up like these officials from back then. If they're even still working, these are both, one of these cases is 23 years old, the other one's about 30 years old. If any of those people are even still around, or those records are still around, to actually find out, like, well, what was maybe details that didn't get released into the press, or what went into the autopsy that, like, was there ever thought that it was something else? But ultimately, at the end of the day, nobody cares, because it's like, well, these are just prisoners and they probably committed murder, even though in at least one of the cases, there was enough doubt that they reversed the death penalty. And people that are incarcerated, we kind of just don't care about them. So here, to me, you have a case where if these were people out in the world who both died these weird deaths that almost seems like a supernatural curse of the electric chair, somebody would have looked into it and said, no, that's not, some scientifically minded person would have said, curses are not real, and electric chairs are not like the shark in Jaws 4 where they can come get revenge if you escape them. They're not the embodiment of death. But because these are just prisoners and nobody values their lives, that's it. That's kind of the end of the story. And as far as I know, unless someone who watches this video has information and wants to leave it in the comments, I'm guessing I'll never know either. But that's why I find it so creepy, because it's one of those cases where the information as we know it seems impossible, but every alternate theory seems equally weird or terrifying or stupid. Thank you for listening to Creepy Real Story Time with Jason David Wong Pargin. The new book comes out before you know it. Links in the description. Here's a trailer.
You know how sometimes you wake up naked and hungover on a friend's trampoline with only fuzzy memories of how you got there? Well, imagine all of civilization did that at once.
Friday, a local man equipped with an implanted groin enhancement lit up the dance floor, but probably not the way he intended. 8 bystanders.
That's the future. The aftermath of bad decisions everyone regrets but would definitely make again. Now imagine it's the future and you're me, living in a trailer with your cat and your mom, bothering nobody. Then one day you find out you've inherited $1 billion from a scumbag biological father you barely knew. The bad news is, you find out he made that money by committing many crimes. In fact, most of the things he did that weren't crimes were only legal because no one had thought to make them crimes yet. Like selling black market technology that supposedly gives people superpowers.
Lookers watched in horror as a man calling himself Lord Rocket collided in midair with a flock of geese. Police say the one...
So now you're in charge of your father's inner circle, a team of con artists who use creepy psychological warfare tricks to secretly run everything behind the scenes. You now have no choice but to work with them, all of you trying to keep a horde of superhuman morons from tearing the city apart. Now imagine that an author wrote all of these events into an award-winning book series. Only you don't have to imagine that part, because it actually happened. The first book was called Futuristic Violence and Fancy Suits. It drew glowing praise from the New York Times, and Publishers Weekly called it subtly brilliant, which is impressive for a book that contained 36 instances of the word "but." And then imagine that for some reason no one stopped David Wong from writing a second book in the series called Zoe Punches the Future in the Dick, which is available for pre-order now pretty much anywhere books are sold. David Wong, aka Jason Pargin, is also the author of the best-selling John Dies at the End series. That one got turned into a movie. So ask your bookstore for Zoe Punches the Future in the Dick by David Wong, or go to futuristicviolence.com.